Discordianism is founded on the notion of the trickster, first proposed by renowned psychologist Carl Jung, to explain the recurring archetype of the devil and its variations. It represents the attempt to revive what has been interpreted to be the dying god cults of ancient times, but often coloured by modern interpretation. In other words, the same tradition of the wise fool that eventually inspired the mystic crew of commerce. The first to recognise the recurring archetype of the dying and rising god was James Frazer in The Golden Bough, first published in 1890, which has had a substantial influence on European anthropology and thought. Frazer's thesis of the dying god and the sacred king had an immense influence on a large number of authors inspired by the occult, such as Robert Graves, William Butler Yeats, H.P. Lovecraft, Sigmund Freud, James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, D.H. Lawrence, Aleister Crowley, Ezra Pound, and Julius Evola. T.S. Eliot acknowledged indebtedness to Frazer in his first note to his poem The Waste Land. And influential was Margaret Murray, the principal theorist of witchcraft as a, quote, pagan survival in the witch cult in Europe. Although modern pagans would deny it, claiming the worship, their, quote, horned god, was ignorantly disparaged by the bigotry of the church. The dying god was universally viewed as a god of evil. Borrowing from Frazer's thesis of the dying god, the, quote, horned god of modern pagans is the lord of the underworld, the sun, while the goddess is the moon. In the Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious by Jung, Jung lists the Feast of Fools as a European adaptation of the trickster archetype. Similarly, Wiccan priestess Margaret Adler in Drawing Down the Moon, which provided the first comprehensive look at modern pagan religions in the US, begins her chapter on Discordianism by mentioning the work of Harvey Cox, who in Feast of Fools, quotes, develops a theory of play, asserting, like others before him, that our society has lost or mutilated the gift of true festivity, playful fantasy, and celebration. End quote. Adler was the granddaughter of Alfred Adler, who collaborated with Freud and found the Adler Society. She also cites the classic study on play written in 1944 by Johann Huizinga, who wrote that play and ritual was interrelated, and that all sacred rites are performed in the spirit of play. Nothing that, quote, the outlaw, the revolutionary, the Kabbalist, or member of a secret society, indeed heretics of all kinds, are of a highly associative, if not sociable disposition, and a certain element of play is prominent in all their doings. End quote. However, according to David Carleon, the romantic notion of the daring political jester, which has been popularized over the last few decades, especially since the protests of the 1960s, Carleon concludes that, quote, popular culture embraces a sentimental image of the clown. Writers reproduce that sentimentality in the jester and academics in the trickster, though it, quote, falters as analysis, end quote. As Carleon points out, the trickster cliché is an adaptation of Shakespeare's concept of the jester, and examples of truth-telling fools in The Twelfth Night, As You Like It, and King Lear. Sir Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe, written in 1819, and Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, written in 1889, are two literary examples of the enduring fashion. As Carleon notes, quote, the jester, comic sidekick in that era's medieval mania, was imagined saying to the king that no one else dared say. End quote. According to Carleon, Soviet philosopher Bakhtin's theory of the carnivalesque, to playfully invert social conventions through humour and chaos, is another obvious influence. The idea of the carnivalesque originated in Bakhtin's Problem of Dostoevsky's Poets, written in 1929, further developed in Rabelais and His World, written in 1940. Bakhtin traces the origins of the carnivalesque to the concept of carnival, itself related to the Feast of Fools. It was one of the leading situationists, Raoul Vaneigem, in his book The Revolution of Everyday Life, written in 1967, who inspired the May 1968 student movement with what could be called carnival liberation theory. Vaneigem observed that, quote, a strike for higher wages or a rowdy demonstration can awaken the carnival spirit, end quote, and, quote, revolutionary movements are carnivals in which the individual life celebrates its unification with a regenerated society, end quote. Archetypes, according to Jung, are fundamentally human themes found throughout world mythology, and are the product of what he calls the collective unconscious. Included motifs are the mother, the child, the trickster, and the flood, among others. Reinvented from culture to culture in mythology and folklore, the trickster is presented as God, spirit, man, woman, anthropomorphic animal, supernatural being, or the occasional mischievous fairy who disobey rules and conventional behaviour, causing chaos while also inspiring some kind of change to occur. The trickster is a shapeshifter, and so has the possibility of transformation. The fool, or the court jester, survives in modern playing cards as the Joker.